Something that has been predicted for decades, a shift in demographics in America, now sparking some fresh conversations about race and what it means politically. An analysis of census data from the Brookings Institute projects the number of white Americans will fall below 50% for the first time ever.
Like, and new data from the U.S. Census is showing us how
more Americans are
multiracial.
The declining white population.
What does this report show us about the future?
People worldwide, a lot of these conservatives who oppose abortion, it's all down to no white birth.
No birth rates.
You look at what's happening in the world, white people are not having babies. And we see people angry about it.
For years now, Americans have been hearing the white population is declining. The demographic is changing. And sometime within the next few decades, white Americans may no longer represent the numerical majority of the population. For some people, this is alarming. For others, it's cause for celebration.
Oh freedom over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave.
While many who identify with the historical majority fear what the decline may mean for their social, political, and cultural influence. Others welcome it, viewing it as the beginning of a new era. For many people, this decline represents far more than a demographic shift. To some, it represents justice. To others, it represents revenge.
We just had the shorts fixed, and they're perfect.
That's good to know.
Some believe that it will mark the beginning of the end of racism. Some believe that it will mark the beginning of the end of white supremacy. Others believe that it will finally open doors that have been closed for generations. Some are convinced that once white people are no longer the majority, power itself will begin to change hands. Perhaps reparations will finally become possible. Perhaps institutions will finally become fair. Perhaps the world will become more balanced. Perhaps centuries of suffering will finally begin to be corrected. And for many people whose communities have experienced discrimination, exclusion, exploitation, and violence, these hopes are understandable. After all, if a group that has dominated society is declining, wouldn't it make sense to assume that its power is declining as well? Wouldn't it make sense to believe that a declining population must eventually produce declining influence? Wouldn't it make sense to believe that once the numbers change, the power will change too? At first glance, it seems perfectly reasonable. In fact, many people assume that numbers and power are the same thing, but are they? Chapter 1. Does power follow numbers? Has power ever really been determined by numbers alone? When we examine history, we repeatedly encounter situations where people with the numbers were not the people with the power. During slavery, a relatively small number of plantation owners exercised control over vast numbers of enslaved people. In prisons, a relatively small number of guards maintain authority over a much larger inmate population. Throughout history, small ruling classes have often governed populations many times their size. Even today, a relatively small number of elected officials, judges, executives, and institutional leaders make decisions that affect millions of people. And in places like South Africa, power and influence have often been shaped less by population size than by control of institutions, resources, and systems. which raises the important question. If power has never been determined solely by numbers, why do so many people assume that a demographic change alone will automatically produce political, economic, and social change? The answer may be that it feels logical. If one population grows, its power should grow. If one population shrinks, its power should shrink. That seems reasonable, but history rarely behaves according to what seems reasonable. Again and again, history presents us with examples where the many were governed by the few, where majorities followed minorities, where those with the numbers possessed little influence, while those with fewer numbers controlled wealth, institutions, law, and opportunity. And this brings us to a deeper question. If numbers alone do not determine power, what does? Chapter 2. The Great Magic Trick. Perhaps the most powerful force in history has never been numbers. Perhaps it's been perception, the ability to influence how people see the world, the ability to shape what people believe, the ability to persuade large populations to support ideas, institutions, and leaders. A magician does not change reality. A magician changes perception. The audience sees one thing while something else is happening behind the curtain. History is fixed with these illusions. People have gone to war because they believed it was necessary. People have voted because they believed it would improve their lives. People have supported systems because they believed those systems represented their interest. Sometimes those beliefs were correct. Sometimes they were not. But whether successful or unsuccessful, the true power was not in force alone. The true power was in persuasion, the ability to convince millions of people to move in the same direction, the ability to define reality itself, to convince people that power comes from one place when it actually comes from another, to convince people that they understand the game while someone else is writing the rules. Perhaps that is the greatest magic trick in history. Not making something disappear, but convincing people that they understand why things happen. And perhaps the greatest illusion of all is the belief that numerical superiority automatically produces power. Chapter 3. They were not always the majority. In fact, one of the biggest assumptions many Americans make is that white people have always been the majority in America, that they arrived as the dominant population, that they founded America as the dominant population, and that they have remained the dominant population ever since. But history is far more complicated than that. Long before the United States existed, this land was populated by indigenous nations. Later came European settlers. Later came millions of Africans through the institution of slavery. The America we know today was shaped by many populations, many migrations, many conflicts, and many competing interests. The story is not one of a permanent majority. It is a story of changing populations, changing identities, changing alliances, changing definitions. And as we continue this journey, we will discover that even the definition of who was considered white was not always what it is today. Chapter 4. Who was white? And this is where the story becomes even more interesting, because when people talk about the decline of white America, they often speak as though the word white has always meant the same thing. Because when people talk about the decline of white America, they often speak as though the word white always referred to the same people, as though the boundaries of whiteness have always been fixed. But history tells a different story. At one point, the definition of white in America was much narrower than it is today. It was centered primarily around Anglo-Saxon Protestants, British ancestry, Protestant religion, and cultural alignment with the dominant institutions of the time. This was the group that most closely associated with political power, economic influence, and social acceptance. But America did not remain static. New populations arrived. Irish immigrants arrived in large numbers. Italian immigrants arrived in large numbers. Eastern Europeans arrived. Southern Europeans arrived. Catholics arrived. Jews arrived. And many of these groups were not immediately welcomed into the dominant white mainstream. They were often viewed as outsiders. They were stereotyped, they were discriminated against, they were frequently described as separate from what many Americans of the time considered the real white people. Yet, over time, those boundaries began to move. Groups that had once been viewed as outsiders were gradually accepted into a broader definition of whiteness. Irish Americans became white. Italian Americans became white. Other European groups became white. And as this category expanded, so did the number of people inside it. But there's another detail that often goes unnoticed. At roughly the same time that these groups were being absorbed into a broader white identity, the original Anglo-Protestant population was becoming a smaller share of the nation. This expansion of the white category and the decline of the original Anglo-Protestant majority occurred during the same general period of American history. Chapter 5. Could it happen again? At this point, another question begins to emerge. If the definition of white people changed before, could it change again? Many people assume the racial categories we use today are fixed, permanent, unchanging, as though they have always existed exactly as they are today. But history suggests otherwise. The categories we use today did not emerge from nature. They were created by institutions, defined by institutions, maintained by institutions. And for most of American history, those institutions were overwhelmingly controlled by people who were considered white and who held political, economic, and cultural power. The census did not create itself. Immigration laws did not create themselves. Racial classifications did not create themselves. These were decisions made by governments, decisions made by lawmakers, decisions made by courts, decisions made by institutions. And throughout most of American history, those institutions were controlled by people who belonged to the very group being defined. Over time, those definitions changed. The boundaries changed. The categories changed. And as those categories changed, the populations contained within them changed as well. Which brings us to the present. One of the most overlooked facts in American demographics is that Hispanic is not considered a race by the Census Bureau. It is considered an ethnicity. As a result, millions of Hispanic Americans already identify as white on the census form.
It is about reflecting who we truly are.
We do not have to choose just one box. This is our community.
Many Americans are surprised to learn this because they imagine the boundaries between Hispanic and white to be fixed. But the census itself does not treat those categories as mutually exclusive. Likewise, millions of Americans today identify with more than one racial background. Interracial marriage continues to increase. Mixed race populations continue to grow. And every generation seems less rigid than the one before it when it comes to racial identity. This raises a question that many people are uncomfortable asking. Who decide who is white? Who decide who is not? And perhaps more importantly, who has the power to change those definitions? History suggests that these categories have never been as permanent as people imagine. History suggests that they have always been subject to revision. Now consider another development. In recent years, the United States accepted white South Africans as refugees after claims of discrimination and violence in South Africa.
A group of white South Africans are now in the U.S. after being granted expedited refugee status. The Trump administration has accused South Africa's black majority government of violence and discrimination against Afrikaners, the white majority that ruled South Africa during apartheid.
Whether one agrees or disagrees with those claims is not the point. The point is that the government still makes decisions about who is welcomed, who is protected, who is incorporated, who belongs. And those decisions have demographic consequences. Just as immigration policies shape populations, just as census certifications shape populations, just as definitions shape populations. Which brings us back to the question that started the entire discussion. When people say that white America is declining, what exactly do they mean? Do they mean the definition that existed in the 18th century, the definition that existed in the 19th century, or the definition that exists today? Final chapter, the real magic trick. At the beginning of this documentary, we were presented with a simple story. The white population is declining, the demographics are changing, and sometime in the future, white Americans may no longer represent a majority of the population. For some people, that was a reason to celebrate. For others, it was a reason to worry. But after examining history, perhaps we should ask a different question. Have we been watching the wrong thing? Throughout this entire discussion, the focus have been on numbers, percentages, population counts, majorities, minorities. But history suggests that numbers alone have never determined who possesses power. History suggests that influence is often shaped by institutions, definitions, perceptions, by the ability to shape how people understand reality, and perhaps that's where the real magic trick occurs. Not making people disappear, not in changing the numbers, but by directing everyone's attention toward one thing while something else is happening somewhere else. The audience watches the hand, the magician performs the trick. The audience watches the percentages, the people with the power define the categories. The audience argues over population projections. The institutions decide who belongs and who does not. And by the time the audience notices what changed, the trick has already been completed. Perhaps that is why history is filled with surprises, because people often focus on the outcomes while ignoring the process that creates them. They focus on the scoreboard while ignoring who writes the rules. They focus on the population while ignoring who defines the population. And maybe that is the lesson here. Not that white people will remain the majority, not that they won't, not that the future is already written, but that history has repeatedly shown us that categories change, definitions change, identity change, and power has often belonged to those who possess the ability to shape those changes. So when someone tells you that white America is disappearing, perhaps the most important question is not whether the numbers are changing. Perhaps the most important question is the same question we have been asking throughout this entire documentary. Who has the power to define what those numbers mean? Because before you can understand the future, you must first understand the magician. And perhaps the greatest magicians in history were never the people performing the trick on a stage. Perhaps they were the people who convinced entire societies to see the world through a particular lens. And if that is true, then the question is no longer whether the trick is being performed. The question is, whether we can see it.
Look closely, for the truth is only an illusion.
I am your man, T. Can, and thank you for tuning in to Royal Black. Until next time.